I guess it depends on what they are, since these two are so picky.
Here. This came from
All
Donna.
right. Well, hello,
I'll find it.
everyone.
I'll find someone.
And hello out there. Already somebody has joined us. I don't know who it is. It can't be Paul because
Paul's here.
Paul's here this week. How exciting. And Karen and Joe and Dorothy are also around the table with me. Oh, whoever it was left. I scared them off.
Already?
Yes. I know. I haven't even gotten offensive yet. Oh, they're back.
You haven't even
Somebody's
started.
back.
Oh, nice.
So welcome back to our Mark Bible study. Now we have two people. Paul assures me that he has been listening, so he is not behind on this at all. And we are continuing to trudge right along. We have had a week of overview. We've had a week of the prologue of Mark, which is basically the first 17 verses. And then we had, hello, someone else joined us. Hello, welcome. And then we've had part 1, part 2, and part 3. And now we are up to part 4. And we will be looking at today the way of Jesus and what Mark sees that Jesus is talking about in terms of following in the way as a disciple. We're looking at Mark 8:22 through 10:52. And of course, I came in here without my Bible. So, a pause. Ding, 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 ding.
What advertisement is coming up?
Who comes to a Bible study without their Bible? Huh?
The
pastor does.
But the pastor knew where to find one, so.
Yes, the pastor knows where her Bible is, which is good. So we are 8:22. That's where we're starting tonight, and going through 10:52. First of all, before we start with that, can you tell me what are some things that you might have noticed about these 2.5 chapters this time as you read? Did you notice anything? Something jump out at you?
I was telling Paul, he healed an awful lot of people. He must have been really tired.
Yeah.
You know, everybody pulling on him.
Yeah. He did heal a lot of people.
And do you think when he talked about his death, do you think they realized that he was really going to die?
I don't think they did. We're going to talk about that a little bit. No, that's why they kept saying, at least in Mark, right?
Yeah.
And they did not understand this,
No.
right?
Yeah.
And especially since they were all so shocked at the end.
And they were afraid to ask him.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Anybody else notice anything? Anything jump out at you?
Sure were a lot of evil spirits in these people.
A lot of evil spirits. Well, we can still see a lot of evil spirits
Yeah.
in a lot of people, can't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We just don't call it that today.
We don't call it that today. You know, the boy that gets exorcised today really seems to have epilepsy, right? It is probably what that would be how we would name that demon. We would name it epilepsy.
Do you think that that's what some of these people have too? They just didn't know.
You know,
When my grandmother did crazy things, they called it hardening of the arteries. You know, now we call it dementia. But that's exactly what was happening, but they called it hardening the arteries.
Yeah. There was something else that just recently I was reminded of that it was called something, and today we have a much
Mm-hmm.
different name for it. But
As you pointed out when you were talking about the lepers, nobody knows what they were. But I mean, I have celiacs and I have skin reactions all the time. I would
Yeah.
have been called a leopard.
a leper, yeah, exactly. Or eczema, or anything
Any of
like
them,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly,
Lots of them.
exactly. Yeah. Well, so our reading today, did anybody notice how our reading opened and closed?
Healing blind man.
There were 2 blind men, right? So our reading today begins and ends with the healing of 2 blind guys, right? The first one doesn't get named. The second guy does, right? Blind Bartimaeus. He actually gets named. So really interesting that a section that has to do with discipleship is framed by 2 stories of getting your sight. Also, yes, go ahead.
And by different means.
By very different
Mhm.
means, right? And what happens in the first blind guy story?
He
He
couldn't
needed-
see first.
He needed, he was
It
foggy.
wasn't clear.
It wasn't
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah, Jesus didn't get it right the first time. How often do you hear that,
They look
right?
Not very.
Mine says they look like trees walking around.
Yes.
And
So
then he spit on them.
and then he spits on them. So if we look at that first one, that you got this blind man, and Jesus what does he do first time? He spits on him, right? He spits on his eyes. He puts saliva on them.
Mhm.
So
Then he puts his hands
yeah.
on.
yeah, before, what did Jesus do with the deaf guy? Do you remember? Yeah, he
Mhm.
Yeah.
gave him a wet willy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And now he's putting that same saliva on his eyes. Now this is a no-no, right? In
Oh, yeah, right.
clean, unclean stuff, you wouldn't.
yeah.
That's an inside thing that should stay inside, right?
Mhm.
So it's a big no-no that Jesus does this. Also, even just touching the blind man, because he would have been considered unclean, which would then make Jesus unclean. But Jesus doesn't care. In fact, he doubles down then afterwards, right? Because he spits on his eyes, and then he's like, "Did that work?" And the guy's like, "Well, a little bit." And so then he lays his hands on him again and says, "This time it's going to work." So Jesus opens eyes there, and then at the end, Jesus opens eyes again. So that's a pretty intense story there. There's a lot of narrative detail there for Mark, don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of narrative detail there. So we want to pay attention. So I think that Mark has decided to put these 2 stories. Remember how last week we reiterated with the whole map thing that Mark does not care about chronology or history.
Right.
Mark is all about getting a message across.
Mm-hmm.
So here, I think that what Mark is saying to us is, all right, I want to open your eyes to what discipleship looks like in the way, or what it looks like to be on the way. Now, I use this phrase because if we look at the end of 52, at the end, 10:52, he says to blind Bartimaeus, immediately Bartimaeus regained his sight and followed him on the way. And this was actually before Christians were called Christians.
Mhm.
They were followers of the way. And so this is, Jesus was about getting people to follow on the way. What do you got, Dorothy?
Well, because the first one was sent back to his village. And
No, he's
No.
no. Read.
Don't
If
go
you,
to the village.
he says, don't
Don't go to the
even
village.
go
Don't
into the
yeah.
village, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure where he's
Yeah.
supposed to go.
Yeah.
Just go home.
He's sending home, saying don't go to.
Oh, but his home wasn't in the village.
Apparently not.
Apparently, he was a hermit. He lived in the township. 3 acre minimum with a septic system.
yeah.
Yeah, not.
They all have septic.
I'm pretty sure there was no system. There was septic,
Yeah.
but no system. So, all right. So we have the two blind man stories that indicate to us there's something that we need to see that is between them. So let's look and see what there is to see. So after the very first story, after the blind guy with the trees, you get Jesus and they're walking around and he says, who am I? Right? Who am I? This is Jesus's question. And they have a whole bunch of answers, but Jesus's answer is, none of those are right. I am the one who dies and rises. I am the one who dies and rises. Because even though Peter says you are the Messiah, a Messiah in ancient Judaism was not a Messiah in the sense of what we think of now. A Messiah in a Judaic culture of the time was somebody who was going to restore Jerusalem, restore Israel, was going to be in the line of David.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, it was somebody who was going to restore Israel and be in the line of David and bring back the glory. In some instances, that Messiah was going to do so pretty violently, and really boot those Romans out, right? So when Jesus is saying to Peter, yeah, you say Messiah, but that you got the wrong idea. I'm going about this. Something different is going to happen. And basically what he says is, I am going to die and rise again. And not only that, but you all, as followers on the way, are going to be ones who deny yourselves. This is what it's going to look like to follow me. So we actually get in our reading tonight, the reading that James, from our James tonight, as we remembered James of Jerusalem. So if any of you want to follow me on the way, you have to deny yourselves. Paul, you and I were sort of talking about that concept earlier. The sharing concept is really sharing is all about denying yourself. For those of you who have had children, you know that when they're little and they're learning to share, or if you can actually remember your own childhood, when you're learning to share, the first thing that happens when they're learning this concept is they start saying, so and so won't share, right? Which really means I want it now. It's my turn, even though they just had it. So yes, so it's a matter of denying yourself. Who am I? I am the one who's going to die and rise. Now, Peter doesn't like this answer, right?
Mhm.
And then Jesus says, well, if you don't like that, guess what? You're also going to have to deny yourself. And then you get this story still on this concept of who am I? You get them going up on the mountain, right? Now, once again, mountains are where super spooky stuff happens, right? God shows up,
Burning bushes.
burning bushes, commandments, right? And you get this voice that comes from heaven again, which happened when else in Mark's gospel? Baptism. Did you notice the difference between the wording? Did you take a look at that? Did you go, that sounds familiar, and jump back to the beginning to look?
Oh.
It's almost the same, but what's different? So the other one is chapter 1, verse 11.
Listen to him.
There's a listen to him. Yep.
You are my son whom I love, and I'm very pleased with you.
Right. So who is the voice? We'll just say God.
God.
Who is God speaking to in the baptism?
To Jesus.
Directly to Jesus, right?
Mhm.
There's also it really doesn't seem that anybody else, remember how we talked about that? Doesn't seem like anybody else hears this, just Jesus. What about the other one?
Well, he's speaking to everyone else.
Now he's speaking to everyone else.
Listen to him.
Yeah. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him, right? So the first one was really to Jesus. And now God is speaking. This is technically called a theophany. All right. So an epiphany is a new idea, a new sight, a new seeing. A theophany is it's got that same ending of the word, right? Phany. But a theophany is God showing up. So that's the technical here. So God shows up here. There's a theophany. And now these words. So who am I? I am the one who's going to die and rise. You are going to be the ones who deny yourselves. And then God gives the final word. This is my son. So at this point, Mark is making a huge theological statement, right? Because so far, who has recognized Jesus?
Just the apostles.
No, they have never recognized who he is. The demons have, and
No.
God has, right? But God has never done it publicly. Now he's done it publicly. And there's also no indication that when the demons speak that the disciples actually hear that. But now, at least Peter, James, and John have heard that. But what does Jesus say as they're coming down off the mountain? Don't tell anyone. And they don't. Because they are not sure what's happened. They are not sure what happened. And so if you've ever had a vision of something and you're not sure what happened, you tend to keep it to yourself so that nobody thinks you're crazy, right?
I don't know. I called Dorothy and asked her if it could be real.
Because you trust Dorothy. Yes. After how many years? 40, 35?
27, something like that.
Somewhere in there. So 25 plus years. Yes. I'm not there yet. I only have 18 with Dorothy, which is still nuts to think about.
Oh,
I can't believe that I have 18 years with the two. It's almost longer than I had with my family. I've lived with you people longer than my family of origin. All right. So then we jump into this really fascinating story of the boy cured of epilepsy, right? And the story is really interesting. Again, lots of detail, right? I mean, lots.
For Mark, there's really a lot.
There is a lot of detail. So this is a story where Mark is like, I got to tell you something.
Is there any thought that more than one person wrote this book of Mark?
Is there any...
Parts with all the detail?
Oh, interesting. So is there, are there two authors? And then, so maybe somebody wrote some of the stories and, the closest that would come to that, I've never heard of like a two author Mark concept. So the closest thing that would come to that is that Mark is gathering together oral stories. And for example, this story is in all three of the synoptic gospels. The healing with this epileptic boy.
Wasn't there something that they could go to when they weren't quite sure? What wasn't there something that was written? I can't remember what it was called.
So there's something called the Q source.
Yeah.
And it is thought that Matthew and Luke had, so they had Mark in front of them,
Mm-hmm.
but then that they also had this other source called Q, which scholars think is a lost source, but it was a sayings
Something that they
source.
could
It was kind of like, Jesus, quotes of Jesus.
go, right. Yeah. Right.
It was, have you ever looked up what is it, good quotes or something like that, used that online? It was like that, right? So it was called, and they've just named it Q for quell, which is some German word. I think somebody online is going to watch this and no,
Look it up.
nobody online. There are no biblical scholars watching it's German. So there. And
and watch it later.
yeah. So that Q source, but that's thought that Matthew and Luke had that, and it was a saying
okay.
source. This particular story, though, does appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which lends it, again, with the multiple attestation theory, that indeed there were, this is probably a story that happened. And it was probably an oral tradition. And if it were an oral tradition that had been around, you wouldn't want to change the story too much, right? So you would put all those details in. There is definitely something going on here where Mark has added a beginning and an ending to it. So Mark adds this whole argument thing at the beginning of the story. Then he has, like, that's added. That's Mark. So they're all, what are you arguing about, right? And then they talk about this, that it's unable to speak. And then you have this, oh my gosh, how much longer am I going to have to deal with you? All of that is Mark. That's not the miracle story proper. Then you get the miracle story, and then at the end, he has this little in-house conversation, right? When he entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, why couldn't we cast this out, right? And he says, only with prayer. So a couple of things about this story. One, I think it's very astute of you that you notice this different writing style. Another is that to pay attention to what Mark has added to the epileptic miracle story. That seems to be where he really wants to draw, because instead of it being really about the miracle, it seems to be much more about faith. He is drawing on that exclamation of the Father, which is my favorite exclamation of a biblical character other than Jesus, well, there are a couple of things in Moses that I love too, but when the dad cries out, I believe, help my unbelief, right? I think that is a cry of faith. That is a cry of faith. It says, I got some, but could you heal what I don't have? So Mark's setup to this about the arguing and then the ending is probably directed at his community. So there was probably something going on in Mark's community about prayer and faith that Mark wanted to correct. We can especially see this because it seems that whenever Mark wants to talk to his own community, he takes the disciples away. Or they go, it's in-house speak. Here, literally, right? When he had entered the house, they went in-house and had a conversation. Why couldn't this kind can only come out with prayer, right? And later on, we're going to get more teaching from Jesus about prayer. But most likely, this is a lot about faith and that. Also, contrast this story, the fact that they couldn't cast him out, with all the success they had when they got sent out 2 by 2. Right? Now, all of a sudden, they're stymied. They got all 12 of them together and they can't rub 2 sticks together. But Mark is really hard on the disciples. Very hard on the disciples. You faithless generation, how much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me. Right? All of that seems to be a Markan addition to the miracle story. So I think Mark's a little frustrated with his own little band of followers.
So he predicts his death, the end of 8, and then again the middle of 9.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes.
So it's in very short.
He does it 3 times in
Yeah,
the reading
it
that
is,
we have
yeah.
tonight. 3 times. Why 3? 3 is a magic number.
7.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to what Dorothy just mentioned. And this is on the flip side of your paper there. So now it's the way, right? So now Jesus is really going to start instructing in the way. I think he did a little bit there with that miracle story, right? Faith and prayer are important on the way. So the very first thing that he's going to teach about is power. And what does power look like on the way? The first thing is, once again, he says, so Jesus, I love this. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. This is 9:30. He did not want anyone to know it. So can you imagine, I pictured like Jesus, like tiptoeing and hiding behind rocks and boulders and like, shh, be very quiet. We're hunting rabbits. Right? I pictured he didn't want anybody to know it. So he's being very quiet. He's being very low key, right? And then turns around and says, okay, so I'm going to tell you this again. I am the one who dies and rises. And then, so then they're afraid, right? They're like, ooh, we don't get this, but we don't want to ask about it because it seems like he's really sincere. So, you know how that is, right? When somebody's like, oh, well, you remember when and you're sitting there going, no, I do not remember that, right?
But it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't understand. I mean, somebody said, I'm going to die and I'm going to rise. Well,
Yeah.
who's going to understand that?
Yeah, so interesting, though. Just
I mean,
listen
you
to...
would want to say, what the heck are you talking about?
Yeah. The what's interesting is I just listened to a podcast on Monday from a Jewish scholar who has done a lot of work on resurrection in the Old Testament, which we don't often think about. And he has a book out. His name is John Levinson, and he has a book out called Resurrection in the Old Testament. I don't think it's that boring, but it's has resurrection in the title. And what he says is that by the time of Jesus, well, in the intertestamental time, do we all know intertestamental time is the time between Malachi and Mark? Well, Paul. All right. So it's this span of time. And in the Catholic Bible, they have intertestamental Bible books. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees, Tobit, Sirach, Bel and the Dragon, Susanna, the Wisdom of Solomon. This is all intertestamental liturgy. Literature. So what he says is there's this trajectory and development of thought. Like he traces it way back into even the Psalms about Sheol, which is a place of death and darkness, dark and dank, and being lifted up from Sheol. And so he says that's kind of the beginnings of this resurrection thing. So we often think that Christians invented resurrection, and we did not, says this guy. We did not. But it is this idea of bringing newness and life where before there was death. So the word, sometimes we're like, well, of course they don't know because they have no idea what resurrection is. They may actually have known what resurrection was. But I think going back to how we started in terms of that Messiah not being, they may have had, well, we've all been in the grocery store looking for our favorite dish detergent, and we can't find it. Now, we've been buying the same dish detergent forever, and we just can't find it. And why can't we find it? Because they've gone and changed the packaging, right? So we are looking for a blue bottle that's shaped like a curvy lady. And now it's an orange bottle that's got a big handle on the side, right? So we just can't see it. So I think that here, the disciples are looking for a Messiah who's in a blue bottle with a curvy lady figure, whereas Jesus' Messiah, his concept of it looks completely different. Now, this is absolutely borne out by the very next story. Because in the very next story, after Jesus is, going around, hiding around rocks, trying to stay out of, right? The disciples are arguing.
About who's the greatest.
And they're arguing over who's the greatest. I am the greatest, right? I mean, they're all Muhammad Ali. I am the greatest, right? So, they don't get it. And then Jesus does something very strange, and he takes a child, which, unless it's a male child, really doesn't mean much. But children, just like in the United States, seen and not heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, almost as if they're doubling down, they get chastised, but then they come back and they're like, oh, Jesus, there is some guy over there, and he is casting out, right? Casting out demons in your name. They're like, he can't do that because he is not part of us. And Jesus is like, right? So they're not getting it. And then he does the whole stumbling block thing. He says, listen, your job, if you think it's even, wait, because this job gets even harder, because even if you put a stumbling block in anyone's way, I put plenty, when I first came here and I was a young whippersnapper of a pastor, I put all sorts of stumbling blocks in people's way. Probably still do. Like when I bring up Virgin Mary stuff. Paul Goatnauer says to me, did you really say what I think you said? So power for if you're on the way looks very different, right? Very different. The next thing that Jesus tackles is institutionalized sin. So it's been institutionalized that divorce was okay, that a husband could give a divorce certificate. And Jesus says, yeah, Moses told you this because of the hardness of your hearts. But from where Jesus is standing and in the context that he's in, he sees that this is just institutionalized sin. That is, that so in the ancient world and in a Jewish ancient world specifically, only the husband had the power to divorce. Only the husband. And so if her husband were to give her a certificate of divorce, Dorothy would find herself in trouble because she would be homeless and familyless. So she would try to go back to her own family, but her own family may not be able to take her in. They may not have the means to support her. She may not be able to get back to her family. And so she and perhaps her children with her would be on their own. And Jesus basically says, what you're doing is consigning the vulnerable to a life of begging. Now, there is this little tag on part, which today I was like, I never read that before. So this is the whole thing about the divorce there. Like, no, it's not good. Now, this is a different context, right? So in today's society, if Dorothy is divorced, she has all sorts of means in order, right? And usually it's a mutual sort of thing, and you go to court and Dorothy will get severance pay from
Maybe
from
today.
yeah. But then notice what happens in 10 verse 10. Then in the house, the disciples ask him. So now we have an in-house teaching. So once again, I'm very convinced by an argument that I read from one of my commentaries that this is Mark speaking to his community. So this is an early church teaching. And I'm going to also say that I believe that's true because verse 12, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, in a Jewish society, that wouldn't have happened. That's a Roman thing. In the Roman world. So remember how I said last week that I didn't think that Mark was from Israel because he didn't know the geography very well.
Right.
Here's another reason why I don't think he was from there, that he was from some other area that that was under Roman law, that wasn't living by purely a Jewish law. So here, Mark is extending that Jesus saying in terms of his own community. And then institutionalized sin, that excluding people on a basis of who they are, second-class citizens. And here Jesus says, oh, let the little children come to me. And in fact, you all need to become like these little children. Let me just pause there. Anything before we move on to the final verses of chapter 10.
I'm cheating. The print's larger. I'm not on my phone. I'm
Looking at your
looking
Bible.
at bigger print.
Yeah, I don't blame you. That's why I love my, because I can make it really big. Then I don't have to wear my glasses if I don't want to. Except I can't when I look at that.
You know, it always bothered me. It doesn't bother me as much now because I've been divorced twice. And I did remarry, after the first divorce. And I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah, well, so remember that this was Jesus speaking and Mark reiterating against a practice that resigned women to be beggars, right? It's a completely different concept
Mhm.
in our modern understanding. Women had no power.
Mhm.
Like, they didn't have a choice in the matter. If my husband didn't like the way I looked at him one day, he could hand me a certificate of divorce and I'd have to go on my way. It's a completely different concept of marriage and divorce than what we have today. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's a completely different concept.
Even in the Jewish community.
Even in the Jewish community. Yes. Even in the Jewish community.
Because they don't
Oh, yeah.
divorce
Yeah.
Jew and Jew.
Yeah. So it really is a different not everything translates, just because we use the word divorce. It was a really different context
Yeah.
for what that divorce meant, and what would have happened to a woman, and what resources she would have. And sometimes in our day and age, a woman initiates
Mhm.
that, right?
Mhm.
But it's a completely different
Yeah.
social context for that. So divorce is still, I do not think, what God intends, right?
Mhm.
I still think that, but there are some times when staying together is a worse sin, right?
Right.
As a wise father said to me when I was contemplating my demise from my first husband, God did not plan on you till death you do you part, being he kills you in the first 2 years.
No.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, there are, and in those cases, those marriage vows were broken long
Day one.
before.
Day one.
Yeah.
Not by
Good
my
questions.
choice.
Good questions. And I don't mean to imply then that we can contextualize all of Scripture,
Right.
right? Like, oh well, in the ancient world it means this, but that doesn't, it doesn't matter
Yeah,
anymore.
Right.
Marriage is to be entered into soberly, like this is, but some things don't appear
Now,
until
wait a minute.
afterwards.
That being said,
You entered in
since
non-soberly.
I was, but since they weren't, does that make it a marriage? I didn't know they weren't, but they weren't.
Let's look the last section here, chapter 10, verses 17 through 45. We have a couple of reversals several reversals. So far, the way includes a different power, which in and of itself is a reversal. It has a sort of reversal on institutionalized sin. And now we're going to look at some more reversals. And the first one is I have followed the law. Am I good? Am I getting in? And I love this story because as much as I can see Jesus sneaking around and hiding behind rocks and boulders previously, now I can see Jesus's face looking at this guy and going, you dear sweet man. Right? I mean, I can just picture it and Jesus loved him. And realizes that there's still something more, that this man loves perhaps more than Jesus. Now, I think sometimes we say, yeah, well, he loves all his riches more. I think that he loves his control more. Because he's trying to control, right? Oh, yeah, sure. I've kept all the commandments,
Yeah,
right?
Right.
I got those boxes checked. And he likes the control that he has when he has money, right? Who doesn't? And now Jesus says,
Go and sell everything.
go give away all that control,
Right.
right? And he went away grieving, for he had many possessions. I think the biggest possession he had was his want for control. And then we get this great story about, eyes of needles and camels and who can get into heaven and who can't, and how am I going to get myself through there? And ultimately, Jesus says, and here's the control thing again, right? How am I going to get through there? And Jesus says, well, for you, there's no chance. But for God, all things are possible. There's the giving up of that control, right? Boy, we all love that. So then Peter's like, oh, yeah,
We've
right?
given up everything.
He's like, Jesus has got to be like, oh my gosh, are you serious? Because Peter's like, oh, we gave everything up. And then Jesus is like, yeah, but the first ones are going to be last, and the last ones are going to be first. And once again, Jesus says to them, I am the one who dies and rises. And here come the sons of Zebedee, good old James and John,
Oh, yeah.
and they want control again, right?
They want the seat at the right.
They want control again.
Yeah.
And so they say, hey, can we sit at your right and your left hand? Jesus like, you sure you can handle it? Oh, yeah. We can, no problem. We can handle that. Anything, we're good to go. And Jesus is like, okay, buckle up, because here it comes. Here it comes. And then the big reversal. Listen, you think this is about fame and glory? You think this is about being on the right side of Judgment Day? Do you think? No. This is about you giving all that control up, all that power up, and being a servant to all. And then we get the story of blind Bartimaeus. And if we've been listening carefully, we say, oh, I see now.
I thought Bartimaeus was the one that was up in the tree.
That's Zacchaeus.
Zacchaeus, okay.
Yeah, that's Zacchaeus.
Okay.
He was out in
They
the
all
tree
sound
for a
the
while.
same.
Zacchaeus was.
Yes. We had a little man up in the tree.
We had a little man in the tree. Huh. All right. Interesting. All right. Last minute comments, questions, ideas, concerns. Everybody online was very quiet tonight. No questions.
So from these three,
Oh, Neil Goldsworth says, good night, all. Drive safe. Good night, Neil.
these three Jesus statements where he says he has to die. So from that, we know that Jesus knew all along he was going to die.
So that's an interesting question. Like, is that something that Jesus said? Or is that something that the gospel writers said Jesus said? Yeah.
Because this being written after that all happened.
It did right, exactly. It is possible that Jesus, well, anything is possible, right? My bet is that Jesus read the writing on the wall, could see what was coming down the pike. We've all been in situations where we've been with people and we're like, oh man, if we keep on this path, we're in trouble. Like, this is right. Or the opposite also, if we stay on this path, I see good stuff, right? That doesn't make us prophetic. It just means we can see the writing on the wall. So I think that there probably came a point in time where Jesus is like, okay. But so I know where this is leading, but this is what I'm hearing from God to keep going on this path. And so he could have at some point said, disciples, once we set foot in Jerusalem, all hell's going to break loose. Right? Did Jesus know he was going to rise? Again, knowing this little bit about the intertestamental Jewish period and resurrection, he may have, but it may not have been what it ended up being in his head. Like, he could have been like, yeah, God's going to lift me up. But that Jewish concept of resurrection didn't have anything to do with bodies resurrected. That's a Christian development.
But he knew all along that he was the Son of God. So
Okay.
I think, I think he would have known.
I don't. The scriptures would tell us that Jesus knew that he was the Son of God. That's the testimony of Scripture. I don't.
And when he called on the Holy Spirit, it was like he knew that was coming from God.
Yeah.
And that he was
I guess what I'm asking is not, did he eventually know? But do you think he knew from the beginning?
Do I? Do you want what Pastor Laura says? Can I end the video? So Pastor Laura would say that Pastor Laura would say that probably Jesus did not know. Did not know from the get-go.
See, I think he did.
And that is
And
a
there's no proof of-
completely
Right.
that is a completely scriptural, biblical, and based in tradition sort of answer. It is faithful. It is totally, this is just the wanderings of a pastor. You are completely welcome to, and would join a huge pantheon of saints. I would there's probably a special room in hell for me and my heretical thoughts.
But that's the crazy thing. We could argue that's why the Jews, when they take their book, they argue
Uh-huh.
the whole thing, and everybody has a different opinion, and nobody's wrong. And we're
You know
not
what-
going to know
Well,
until we get up there.
I
None
just
of us
heard-
were there then.
I just heard a lovely, again, a podcast I've been listening to, another Jewish scholar talking about how when Jews get together and argue over scripture, it's a
Mhm.
form of worship.
Mhm.
And for us, it's a way of putting other people down. Like, I have to be right. And instead, I love that Jewish concept of it being worship. Like the fact that you care so passionately about it and I care so passionately about it, and we're willing to put ourselves out there for the sake of our faith and for who God is. It is indeed, it's a form of worship. So there probably would have come a point in time where I would have been like, Joe, I got to tell you why you're wrong. But I don't have to do that, right?
Dorothy gave me a book, and I'm reading about Moses, and I have decided this or next Easter I am not watching the Ten Commandments because this book is telling me different things about Moses, and in my head I've got that I've memorized the Ten Commandments. The Carlton Heston.
Charlton,
Yeah. Every year I record it and I watch it 4 hours. But one of the things it said in there is that Moses knew he was an Israelite. See, and in the show, I mean, he's royalty, and it wasn't that the Pharaoh sent him out. He left because
he killed somebody.
Yeah, he killed somebody, and that he thought that he was saving his people that way, and they didn't like it.
Yes.
So he left, and he was 40 years old when he left. He was 80 when he was getting all the people out. I'm thinking, so
years were different back then.
that's true. That's true. But and there's a new Ten Commandments out, and I criticized that one until I hit the book, and read Exodus again, and that one was truer than the other. The other is such a spectacular.
Oh, it's quite something, isn't it?
It's quite something.
It's quite something.
So
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you
see what
all.
it
And
Thank you.
we meet
Comes
again
from my
next
house.
week.
No.
And next week we read chapter 11,
11,
verse
12.
1 through 13, verse 37. 11, 1 through 13, 37.
No.
Have a great evening. Drive safely, you all, and you all behave in
We
your
actually get
homes.
to go home now.
Bye.
What time did that movie last till?